In episode 5, with Coach Scott sentenced to death, he goes back to his makeshift prison and he starts talking up Aquila because she's gravitated towards this deer that is going to need feeding because the deer's mother is dead, and Coach Scott's mom used to foster kittens. But that conversation turns into Coach Scott asking, "Any idea what they're going to do to me?" And Aquila tells him, I don't know anything. Which is true. Most of Aquila's time recently has been spent with Lottie and Travis. The rest of the group, though, is discussing what exactly they're going to do with Coach Ben. While they sentence him to death, nobody really wants to be the person to pull the trigger. At one point, Lottie says, "Here, this might help." Travis drew it during the trial. And it's a picture of 3 people with a body levitating above it. Lottie thinks that maybe it's a clue to what it wants. Shauna doesn't really care about any of that. She feels like a fitting punishment for Ben to die would be to get set on fire. He tried to set them on fire after all, so an eye for an eye sort of thing. Everybody thinks that is a crazy idea, and Natalie tells her that's not justice, that's torture. Natalie decides the fairest way to do this would be a firing squad. Thing is, they only have one gun, so they decide to draw for it. The Queen of Hearts will decide who is the one to pull the trigger, and when it's done, Thaisa is holding the card. Ty doesn't really want to do this either, but she drew the card, she's going to have to, and her and Van head off in the woods to practice. It's not like Ty is a great shot. But with the pressure of hitting Coach Scott and killing him, she's an even worse shot. Van does her best to remind Thaisa, hey, he did try to murder us, and that is something that Ty does believe. She did, after all, sentence him to death, but now that she's the one who has to pull the trigger, it's just hitting different. So Van comes up with a possible solution. She brings up the fact that on the show Family Matters, Urkel goes into a machine and comes out as Stefan. He's a completely different person. And they know that something similar happens to Thaisa. So maybe if she can tap into that sleepwalking whatever it is, maybe she won't have to be the one to pull the trigger. Coach Scott ends up dying, and everyone ends up happy. The question then is, how exactly do you tap into that? While those two try to figure out how to tap into Thaisa's sleepwalking alter ego, back at the camp, Misty has prepared a last supper for Coach Ben. She's really broken up about the fact that she couldn't save him. She lets him know that, unfortunately, they're coming for him at dusk. So at least now Coach Scott has an idea of what's going to happen. And Misty wasn't the only one to prepare a gift for somebody else, as Melissa made a little present for Shauna. She sneaks up on her, she gives it to her, sheepishly, and Shauna finally goes, "Why do you even like me?" And Melissa admits, it's because you're not scared of the bad parts of you. Yeah, you used to be kind of a pushover, but something happened to you, and now you just don't care. She leaves Shauna alone, and Shauna admires the gift that she was given, which was a holder for her knife, which is something she needed. Meanwhile, Lottie, Travis, and Aquila, they don't really care what happens to Coach Ben too much because they're so focused on Aquila and getting back to the cave. They head there, and Aquila's planning on going in and passing out, where Travis would run in to save her, hoping that Aquila would get a vision and they would have some more idea about what it wants or how to get out, just something. Because as Travis said, it's gravitated more towards Aquila than him. Aquila ends up having a vision. It's of Coach Scott. Coach Scott is tied up, but he's a giant, and it's kind of like Gulliver's Travel. Aquila using Coach Scott's body to seemingly get home. Because of this vision, all 3 of them realize that Coach Scott is the key to getting home, and they need to rush back to camp to make sure that he isn't murdered. As they rush back, the girls are preparing Coach Scott, tying him to a tree. A lot of them are emotional about this whole situation. Ben begging the girls, telling Natalie, "You don't have to do this," but it's already been decided. He makes one last-ditch attempt at swaying them, but it becomes clear that they're not going to change their mind. Right before Ty is about to pull the trigger, Aquila, Travis, and Lottie show up, saving him, and explaining to the group, Aquila had a vision, and we need to keep this guy alive because he is our way out of here. That doesn't mean, though, that people like Shauna aren't out for vengeance. Shauna's pissed that Coach Scott wasn't killed. After all, he was sentenced to death, but she's going to make sure that Coach Scott doesn't escape. She doesn't do it on her own. She gets agreement from the group. But late at night, her and Melissa head into the camp where they're holding Ben, and Shauna hands Melissa the knife, telling her, "You shouldn't be scared of the bad parts of you either." And then Melissa walks over and cuts Coach Scott's Achilles tendon. It is nasty. When Shauna and Melissa walk back to camp, they're arm in arm, covered in blood. Shauna's pretty gleeful about it, and Natalie tells her, "You don't have to enjoy it this much." To which Shauna says, "Well, you don't have to be a saint about it." And then both Shauna and Melissa shock the entire group by heading into a tent together and kind of announcing their relationship with one another. And I think it's pretty safe to say that Shauna is the top. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We're allies here on the channel. Moving on to present day. Misty is pretty gutted about losing yet another friend, but finding out what happened to Lottie, that's kind of her specialty, being a citizen detective. So she heads to the morgue. She ends up blackmailing the coroner into giving her the personal effects that Natalie had on her. And right before she leaves, she grabs some DNA underneath Lottie's fingernails just to test them out for later. She then collects the rest of the group. Ty, Van, and Shauna, even though she doesn't want to, and she gives them the bad news that Lottie is passed. This is shocking to all of them. The story that most people are going with is Lottie just fell down the stairs and had an accident, but Misty doesn't believe it. She feels like that's fishy. And shortly after bringing this up, Shauna has the audacity to ask Misty, "Where were you yesterday?" She basically accuses Misty, where Misty says, "So you think I killed her and then held a meeting to tell you about the death?" And Shauna points out, that's a really good way to make you not seem guilty. But where were you? And Misty tells her, "I was at work that day. You know that." Shauna points out that Misty left early. Nobody knows where she went, but that wasn't after Shauna got conveniently locked in the freezer. And if anybody had a reason to be angry at Lottie, it would be Misty because of what happened with Natalie. Misty's so pissed off at this accusation that she tells the group, "I had nothing to do with any of it, and I'm going to find out what happened to Lottie." She heads home, she starts looking over Natalie's personal items, and she realizes that the cell phone that Lottie owns wasn't on her person, which is weird. The next place that Misty is planning on going to continue the investigation is the apartment building where Lottie was found. She was found in the basement. But as she's heading off to the apartment building, she's being followed, unknowingly, by Shauna, who still thinks that Misty had something to do with this. Although Shauna's being followed, and she realizes she's being followed. She gets pretty sick of it, so she turns into an alley, stops to confront the person, and it's Walter. He tells her that he's appointed himself as the chief investigator for the death of Lottie, and his first suspect is Shauna. After all, she did kill Adam. Shauna points out that it could have easily been Misty or Walter. And Walter says, "This wasn't Misty's work, but I have an idea of where she's going. Why don't you come along and help me out with this?" Well, Misty, Walter, and Shauna all head to the same location. Van and Ty went off to get lunch. Now, Van is way more upset about the death of Lottie than Ty. Ty seems like this is just normal behavior. And Van asks her, "Hey, yesterday, when we met up at Columbus Circle, where did you go beforehand? It's like a 15-minute train ride tops, and you had an hour by yourself." Ty tells her that she just went to scope everything out. She hired the horse and carriage. She grabbed some cash. She basically got ready for the date. She asks Van, "What, you think that I killed Lottie and ran over to meet you at a pretzel cart?" And Van tells her, "No, that's not what I'm saying." But this awkwardness gets interrupted when Taissa gets a phone call from her ex. Simone had called to see if Ty wanted to spend some time with Sammy and their dog in the park. Sammy had been asking for her. Van came and tagged along, and right away Simone knows exactly who Van is. But the meeting between Sammy and Taissa doesn't last long. All of a sudden, Sammy just gets up, grabs a dog, and signals to Simone that he wants to leave, which is really confusing to Taissa. And the reason that the conversation was so quick was because the only question Sammy had was, "Are you still my mom?" And Ty said, "I'm always going to be your mom." And that was it. Sammy got up and left. Now, in the city, Misty has arrived at the apartment complex. He starts looking for clues, and she decides to ask the bellhop whether he saw Lottie the day before. What she learns is the fact that not only did the bellhop see Lottie the day before, but that Lottie lived there because Lottie's dad lives there. Lottie lived there until the parents' divorce. So she was there visiting her father. But her father has dementia. He was a very successful business guy, but at times he also thinks that he's still running a company. That's not going to stop Misty, though. She knows that she needs to get into Lottie's bedroom to see if she can find her phone. Armed with a dessert, she heads up to the penthouse, pretending to be one of the neighbors, and she's able to weasel her way in to Lottie's dad's apartment. Upon searching around, though, she finds out that she is not the only one there, because Walter and Shauna have beat her to the punch. The way that they were able to access the apartment was by posing as IT technicians looking to improve the internet. This sparks a pretty big pissing contest between Walter and Misty. Misty telling Walter, I'm in charge of this investigation, and Walter willing to share what they find. But that's something that Misty is not interested in at all. She's also quite offended about the fact that Walter has enlisted Shauna, of all people, to help out with this. The two groups split up. Walter trying to hack Lottie's internet history, and Misty after her cell phone. Misty is able to get Walter and Shauna kicked out of the apartment for a little bit, but that doesn't stop Walter from continuing to hack. While he's doing that, Shauna's just trying to play this out in her head, because it doesn't make sense to her. Why would Lottie come to her house if she had her dad's house the entire time at her disposal? Walter says maybe she needed a friend, but Shauna dismisses that. And Walter tells her, you're either a friend or you're not. Like with Misty, I'd put you squarely in the not friend category. Shauna gets offended by this and says, you're trying to ruin her investigation. And Walter says, I know what makes her toes curl, and that's a challenge. Which is what I'm now giving her. Shauna tells him, if it turns out you did kill Lottie just to get Misty off, that wouldn't be surprising at all. So Walter poses a challenge. I'll give you my DNA if you give me a hair sample and I get your DNA. And Shauna's not about to do that at all. She storms off, but she did leave the hat that Walter gave her behind, which had a piece of her hair, which gave Walter the DNA anyway. He also scored the information from Lottie's phone before Misty did. And Misty does locate the cell phone, but she finds out that Walter had wiped it clean. This whole time, Walter thought that they were having fun, having a game, but Misty, it was no game. It wasn't fun. And Misty really cuts him to the core by saying, I can't believe I let somebody as despicable as you give Caligula a bath. I mean, that really hurts Walter. While there's no closure for the investigation, there is a little bit of closure for Mr. Matthews, Lottie's dad. Shauna went into Lottie's bedroom, and Mr. Matthews came in, thinking that Shauna was his daughter. He starts talking to Lottie as if she's still a teenager about cleaning her room and whatnot, and Shauna just played along with it, realizing that the old man was just seeing things, and he needed to hear from his daughter. So that's what Shauna did, playing a role. She gave Mr. Matthews a hug and made him feel a lot better in that moment.
Thank you so much for checking out this recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel and subscribing to my Patreon. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. If you left a comment, I don't get back to you. I usually don't check the comments unless they're like a super comment. Also, if you don't see the next video up on the end screen, not to worry. It'll be up in a day or two.